I wasn't snooping. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was just standing there waiting for coffee. And then I heard a sentence that made my stomach drop. A confession about my daughter, about her wedding. And it was never meant for me to hear. This was shocking. Because in that one moment, everything I thought I knew about the wedding, the marriage, and my role as a parent collapsed. Most parents worry about speeches, seating charts, or whether the cake will melt. I was suddenly questioning whether the wedding should happen at all. And here's the part that still messes with me: what I did next wasn't emotional. It was calculated. Stay with me, because the confession itself is only half the story. My reaction is the part that changed everything. Let me explain how this situation even became possible, because on the surface it sounds unreal. Weddings are supposed to be joyful. They're marketed as beautiful, emotional, almost magical events where everything comes together perfectly. But behind the flowers, the music, and the smiles, weddings are pressure chambers. They bring out parts of people that usually stay hidden. Stress doesn't just make people emotional, it makes them careless. This was shocking to realize in hindsight, but research actually supports it. Studies on major life transitions show that events like weddings rank among the highest stress points in adult life, right alongside moving, losing a job, or illness. Cortisol levels spike. Emotional regulation drops. People speak without filtering. They assume privacy where there isn't any. And when that happens, truths leak out in the most ordinary ways. What made this even more dangerous was the environment. Everyone was busy. Everyone was distracted. Conversations overlapped. Doors were left open. Voices carried farther than they should have. No one was guarding their words because everyone believed they were surrounded by safety. That illusion of safety is exactly where honesty slips out unintentionally. I wasn't looking for anything. That part matters. There was no suspicion leading me, no intuition screaming that something was wrong. I wasn't playing detective or checking corners like some dramatic movie scene. I was doing something painfully normal, standing still, waiting. Thinking about how fast the day was moving and how little time there was left before everything became official. That's what makes moments like these so unsettling. They don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with warning signs. They happen quietly, disguised as background noise, until one sentence cuts through everything else. This was shocking because it reframed the entire idea of control. Parents like to believe they're prepared for big moments. You think you've asked the right questions. You think you've had the serious talks. You think you know where the risks are. But real life doesn't respect preparation the way we want it to. It exposes gaps instead. Weddings especially magnify those gaps. They force people into roles they're not emotionally ready for. They accelerate timelines. They turn "we'll talk about it later" into "there is no later." And when that pressure builds, secrets don't just stay hidden, they start pressing outward. What many people don't realize is that secrets don't always come from malice. Often, they come from fear. Fear of ruining a moment, fear of being judged, fear of consequences. Psychologists often describe this as avoidance disguised as protection. Someone convinces themselves they're sparing others pain, when in reality they're sparing themselves discomfort. That idea sat heavily with me even before I understood the full situation. Because once you become a parent, you learn that discomfort is unavoidable. You carry it so your child doesn't have to, or at least that's what you believe you're doing. This was shocking because it forced me to confront a difficult truth about parenting adult children. At some point, protection shifts from control to trust. And trust is terrifying because it means accepting that your child will make decisions you can't intercept in time. Another thing people don't talk about is how weddings create emotional blind spots. Everyone wants the day to go smoothly, so problems get minimized. Red flags get painted beige. Awkward truths get postponed. And anyone who disrupts that flow risks becoming the problem, even if they're telling the truth. That creates an unspoken rule: don't rock the boat. But what happens when the boat is already taking on water and no one wants to say it out loud? This is where the importance of the moment becomes clear. Because overhearing a confession before a wedding isn't just about information. It's about timing. Timing changes the moral weight of knowledge. The same truth spoken months earlier would feel manageable. The same truth spoken months later would feel like betrayal. But right before a wedding, truth becomes volatile. That volatility is what made everything feel so heavy so quickly. Another layer people underestimate is the identity shift happening in a parent during a child's wedding. You're not just attending an event. You're watching a chapter close. You're surrendering a role you've held for decades. And surrendering control makes people cling harder to certainty. That's why uncertainty at this stage hits so hard. This was shocking because it interrupted that transition. Instead of focusing on pride or nostalgia, I was forced into vigilance. Instead of celebrating, I was calculating. Instead of letting go, I was suddenly responsible again in a way I hadn't expected. There's also something deeply human about overheard truths. When someone chooses to confess, they prepare. They frame the narrative, they control the tone. But when you overhear something, you receive it raw, unedited, unprotected. That rawness makes it feel more real, even if context is missing. Experts often say that information gained accidentally feels more threatening because it bypasses consent. Your brain doesn't get time to prepare. It just absorbs and reacts. That's exactly what happened. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about drama. I wasn't thinking about confrontation. I wasn't thinking about morality in abstract terms. I was thinking about consequences, about timing, about whether knowing something automatically means acting on it. That question doesn't have an easy answer. What made this even more complex was the social expectation surrounding weddings. There's an unspoken agreement that problems are handled later. That honesty can wait. That appearances matter more than timing. And breaking that agreement makes you the villain, no matter how good your intentions are. This was shocking because it forced me to choose between social harmony and personal responsibility. And here's the part people don't like to admit. Sometimes doing the right thing guarantees that someone will be angry with you. Sometimes wisdom doesn't look heroic. Sometimes it looks quiet, awkward, and misunderstood. That realization settled in before I even fully processed what I'd heard. And that's why this moment mattered more than the confession itself. Because once you overhear something that changes the stakes, you can't go back to ignorance. You can't unknow it. You can't pretend it didn't happen. Knowledge creates obligation, even when you don't want it to. This is how ordinary moments turn into defining ones, not through intention, but through timing. Not through drama, but through consequence. Not through choice, but through exposure. And standing there, realizing that everything I thought I knew about the day might be incomplete, I understood that whatever came next wouldn't just affect the wedding. It would affect relationships, trust, and the shape of our family moving forward. This is how it actually happened, and the simplicity of it is what makes it unsettling. There was no dramatic buildup, no raised voices, no whispering in dark corners. It was a conversation spoken at a normal volume by people who believed they were alone, using the kind of casual tone people use when they think the world isn't listening. This was shocking because the words didn't sound rehearsed. They weren't emotional or cautious. They were practical, matter of fact. The kind of words people use when they've already accepted something as true and are no longer wrestling with it internally. Let me explain how fast the shift occurred. 1 second, my mind was on logistics. Timing, seating, small details that feel important only because you're trying to stay useful. And then one sentence landed in my awareness and everything else dropped out of focus. Sound narrowed, time slowed. That ordinary human response when your brain recognizes a threat before your heart can catch up. This is how shock actually works. It doesn't always come with panic. Often it comes with stillness. A strange calm where your body freezes while your mind races through consequences at an impossible speed. What made it worse was that the confession wasn't framed as a problem. It was discussed as if it were already settled, as if the decision had been made long ago and everyone involved had quietly agreed not to examine it too closely. That kind of certainty is unsettling because it leaves no obvious entry point for intervention. This was shocking because it revealed a hidden layer of the situation I didn't even know existed. Not just the information itself, but the fact that multiple people seem to know it already. That realization carries its own weight when you understand that you're not late to the truth, but excluded from it. Psychologists talk about something called informational betrayal, which happens when a person discovers that critical information was withheld from them while others were allowed to know. The emotional response isn't just anger, it's disorientation. Your mental map of relationships suddenly stops matching reality. That's exactly what happened in that moment. Every interaction from the previous days replayed in my mind under a new light. Small comments that felt harmless before now felt loaded. Casual reassurances now sounded strategic. It's disturbing how quickly trust can feel conditional once context changes. This is how the mind tries to regain control. It rewrites the past to make the present make sense. Another thing that struck me was how easily people justify silence when it benefits momentum. Weddings move fast, Decisions pile up. There's a constant sense that stopping to address something uncomfortable will derail everything. And so silence becomes practical. Convenient, almost responsible. This was shocking because silence, in this case, wasn't passive, it was active maintenance. It was something people were choosing every day, knowing that once the ceremony happened, the cost of speaking would multiply. That realization introduces a moral dilemma that doesn't have a clean answer. When does protecting someone's happiness become enabling harm? When does timing outweigh truth? And who gets to decide? I wasn't angry yet. That part surprised me. Instead, I felt an intense pressure to understand, to gather context, to figure out what I didn't know before reacting to what I had just learned. Because reacting too quickly can cause damage that can't be reversed. This is how real responsibility feels. Not dramatic, heavy. What complicated everything was the role I occupied in that moment. I wasn't just a parent. I wasn't just a guest. I wasn't just an observer. I was someone who now held information that could change the course of the day and possibly the future. That kind of power is uncomfortable, especially when you never asked for it. There's also a social rule we rarely question. Overheard information is treated as less legitimate than confessed information, as if the method of discovery somehow reduces its validity. People will say things like, "You weren't meant to hear that," as though intention determines truth. This was shocking because the truth doesn't care how it's delivered. Consequences don't adjust based on privacy expectations. Reality remains unchanged, regardless of whether it was whispered or shouted. At the same time, I understood why people cling to that rule. It provides an escape. It allows everyone to pretend nothing happened. It offers comfort through denial. But denial has an expiration date. Another layer of complexity was the emotional proximity of the wedding itself. There was no time buffer, no days or weeks to process quietly. Everything was compressed into hours. That compression intensifies emotional reactions and increases the risk of irreversible decisions. Behavioral researchers call this temporal pressure distortion. When deadlines approach, people prioritize short-term stability over long-term outcomes. They choose whatever option reduces immediate discomfort, even if it creates greater harm later. This was shocking because I could feel that pressure pulling at me in real time. I noticed how my body reacted before my mind fully caught up. My shoulders tightened, my breathing changed, not in a dramatic way, but enough to signal that something inside me had shifted. That's often how intuition manifests. Quietly, physically, without language. And yet, intuition alone isn't enough. Acting on it without reflection can turn concern into chaos. What made this moment especially difficult was the absence of a clear villain. There was no obvious malice, no cruelty. Just people making choices that felt safer in the moment, hoping consequences would somehow resolve themselves later. This was shocking because it challenged the idea that harm requires bad intentions. Sometimes harm grows out of avoidance, convenience, and fear of disruption. I also became acutely aware of how weddings function as social performances. Everyone plays a role. Everyone follows a script. And anyone who breaks character risks being blamed for ruining the show. That awareness changes how you see everything around you. The smiles feel fragile. The laughter feels rehearsed. The celebration feels conditional. This is how isolation can happen in a crowded room. I couldn't unhear what I had heard, but I also couldn't immediately speak it. That tension created a kind of internal standoff between urgency and caution, between responsibility and restraint. This was shocking because it forced me to confront a question I had never seriously considered before. Is it better to act too early and be wrong, or to wait and risk being too late? There was no guidance for this moment. No script. No universally accepted rule. Just judgment, intuition, and the weight of potential fallout. And standing there, surrounded by preparations and expectations, I realized that whatever I chose next would define more than just this day. It would define how trust moved forward, how truth was handled, and how silence would be interpreted long after the music stopped and the guests went home. This is where things became complicated in a way I never expected. The real conflict didn't happen outside. It happened quietly, entirely inside my own head, while everything around me continued as if nothing had changed. People laughed. Phones rang. Plans were adjusted. And I stood there carrying a truth that suddenly felt heavier with every passing minute. This was shocking because I realized how unprepared we are for moments like this. No one teaches you what to do when silence feels safer for everyone else but dangerous for someone you love. There's no checklist, no clear right answer, just a growing pressure that settles in your chest and refuses to move. Let me explain how the internal debate unfolded. One part of me said, stay calm, gather facts, don't react emotionally. Another part of me said, time is not neutral. Every minute that passes is a choice. Doing nothing is also doing something. And those two voices argued relentlessly while my face stayed neutral and my behavior stayed polite. This is how emotional labor works. You perform normalcy while managing chaos internally. What made this even harder was the fear of being wrong. Not just mistaken, but catastrophically wrong. What if I misunderstood what I heard? What if context changed everything? What if my reaction caused damage that couldn't be undone? That fear doesn't just slow you down, it paralyses you. Psychologists call this anticipated regret. The pain we imagine feeling in the future can outweigh the discomfort we feel in the present. And in moments like this, anticipated regret becomes a powerful silencer. This was shocking because I realized how often people stay quiet not because they don't care, but because they care too much about the consequences. Then came the other fear. The one people don't like to admit out loud. The fear of being blamed, of becoming the person who ruined everything. Weddings carry emotional expectations that border on superstition. If anything goes wrong, someone must be at fault. And the person who speaks uncomfortable truth often becomes the easiest target. This is how silence maintains its power. It doesn't threaten you directly. It offers protection in exchange for compliance. I also became aware of how quickly loyalty gets tested in moments like this. Loyalty to your child, loyalty to family harmony, loyalty to truth, loyalty to timing. These loyalties don't always align, and choosing one can feel like betraying another. This was shocking because I had always believed loyalty was simple. Turns out it's situational, layered, and sometimes mutually exclusive. There's a strange phenomenon that happens when you hold information no one knows you have. You start observing people more closely. Their tone, their phrasing, their confidence. You search for confirmation or contradiction in every interaction. Not because you want drama, but because your brain is desperate for clarity. And clarity didn't come. Instead, what emerged was ambiguity. People spoke carefully. Conversations stayed shallow. Everything felt curated. That's when I realized something unsettling. Silence doesn't just hide truth, it reshapes behavior around it. This was shocking because it made me question how long this had been going on, how many conversations I had unknowingly walked past, how many decisions had already been influenced by information I didn't have access to. Another layer entered the conflict then: protection. Not protection from pain, but protection from shock. There's a difference. Pain can be processed, shock destabilizes, and weddings are emotional fault lines. Adding seismic information at the wrong moment can fracture people in ways that take years to repair. This is how rationalization sneaks in. You tell yourself you're protecting someone by delaying the truth. You frame silence as kindness. You convince yourself there will be a better moment later. But later is an illusion we cling to when now feels unbearable. What complicated everything further was my awareness of power dynamics. Who would be believed? Who would be dismissed? Who would be accused of overreacting? Families have unspoken hierarchies, and truth doesn't land equally across them. This was shocking because I realized that speaking up wouldn't just release information, it would activate politics. I also noticed something uncomfortable about myself: a desire to be certain before acting, to eliminate doubt entirely. But life doesn't offer certainty on demand. Waiting for it can mean waiting forever. This is how people miss windows. Not because they didn't care, but because they waited for clarity that never fully arrives. As the hours passed, my internal dialogue became quieter but heavier, not resolved, just condensed, like a storm that stops making noise but hasn't gone anywhere. That kind of quiet is dangerous. It feels like calm, but it is. This was shocking because it taught me how emotional suppression masquerades as composure. There was also the question of intent. Did the person involved mean harm? Or were they trapped in their own avoidance? Intent matters morally, but impact matters practically. And when stakes are high, impact usually wins. That realization forced me to confront something uncomfortable about fairness. Is it fair to disrupt someone's happiness over something they may not even fully understand themselves? Is it fair to let happiness proceed on a foundation that might crack later? This isn't philosophy. This is real life with real consequences. I found myself replaying memories from my child's past. Moments where trust mattered, where protection mattered, where timing mattered. Parenting doesn't end when your child grows up. It changes form, but the instinct remains. This was shocking because I realized that instinct was louder than fear. Not louder yet, but persistent, unwilling to be dismissed. There's also a loneliness that comes with holding something like this. You can't confide. You can't ask advice openly. You can't even fully acknowledge it without triggering the very chaos you're trying to prevent. So you carry it alone. That loneliness sharpens decision-making in strange ways. It strips away performance and forces you to ask one simple question. If no one ever thanked me and everyone misunderstood my motives, what would still be the right thing to do? That question doesn't provide comfort, but it provides direction. And sitting there, surrounded by celebration and expectation, I knew that whatever came next wouldn't be clean or easy. It would be human, flawed, risky, but it would be intentional. Because silence, once recognized, stops being neutral. It becomes a choice that defines you whether you speak or not. This is how time became the real enemy, not the confession itself, not the people involved. Time. Because once you hear something that changes everything, every passing minute feels charged. Neutral moments stop existing. Even ordinary actions start carrying meaning you didn't assign to them before. This was shocking because I realized timing doesn't just affect outcomes. It shapes morality. The same truth spoken at different moments can feel either responsible or cruel. And the closer the wedding came, the sharper that distinction became. Let me explain how this pressure showed up. People kept asking harmless questions. Are you okay? Do you need anything? Did you see the schedule? Each question landed differently now. Every interaction felt like a test I didn't agree to take. Smile too much and you feel dishonest. Say too little and people sense something is off. This is how emotional concealment drains you, not through big lies, but through constant self-editing. I started noticing how often society treats weddings as untouchable timelines. As if once a date is set, reality must pause out of respect. Problems are postponed. Doubts are minimized. Red flags are reframed as nerves. Everything becomes temporary except the ceremony itself. This was shocking because it exposed how rituals can override reason. There's a cultural belief that love, once publicly committed to, will somehow correct unresolved issues. That vows act like erasers. That the momentum of a wedding can carry people past truths they were avoiding. But statistics don't support that belief. Studies on marital satisfaction show that unresolved issues present before marriage don't disappear. They compound. And yet, no one wants to be the person who introduces logic into a moment fueled by emotion. I felt that resistance everywhere. Not spoken, just implied. A quiet expectation that nothing heavy should be introduced now, that anything uncomfortable could wait. That postponement equaled protection. This was shocking because postponement doesn't eliminate consequences, it only relocates them. I began calculating time in strange ways. Not hours, opportunities. When would be the last moment to speak before silence turned into consent? When would intervention stop being preventive and start being disruptive? Those lines aren't marked clearly. They blur as deadlines approach. This is how urgency distorts judgment. I also noticed how easily people mistake calm for agreement. Because I wasn't reacting outwardly, the assumption became that everything was fine. That assumption spread quietly. It settled into the room like a false sense of security. This was shocking because silence creates narratives whether you intend it to or not. There's a particular kind of guilt that comes with knowing something and watching others operate without it. You feel complicit even if you never asked to be involved. That guilt doesn't announce itself. It just sits there, growing heavier with each laugh, each plan, each moment of celebration. I found myself wondering how many major life decisions are made this way, with key information withheld, not maliciously, but conveniently. How often people step into futures they didn't fully choose because no one disrupted the moment. This is how regret gets delayed, not avoided. The wedding environment amplified everything. The symbolism, the permanence, the public commitment. Once vows are spoken, reality becomes harder to adjust. Truth doesn't vanish, but its cost increases. This was shocking because it reframed the idea of ruining a day. Maybe the real damage comes from protecting a day at the expense of years, but even knowing that doesn't make action easier. There was also the fear of misalignment. What if my understanding of the situation didn't match how my child would experience it? What if what felt urgent to me felt irrelevant to them? Parents often assume responsibility long after authority has ended. This is how good intentions collide with autonomy. I struggled with the possibility that speaking up might fracture trust rather than protect it, that my child might see my concern as interference. That timing could overshadow intention. And yet, waiting carried its own risks. Silence could later be interpreted as approval, or worse, betrayal. "You knew and didn't tell me" is a sentence that destroys relationships quietly but permanently. This was shocking because it revealed how silence doesn't just protect the present, it shapes future narratives. I kept returning to one uncomfortable truth. There is no version of this where everyone walks away unscathed. There are only different distributions of pain. So the real question becomes who absorbs it and when. That question doesn't have a moral answer. It has a personal one. I thought about the psychology of last chances. Humans are terrible at recognizing them. We assume there will be another conversation, another moment, another opening, but life doesn't always provide clean windows. This was shocking because I could feel a window closing without knowing exactly when it would shut. There's also something destabilizing about realizing that doing the right thing might look wrong to everyone else. That courage rarely comes with applause in real time. That sometimes it comes with silence, confusion, or blame. That awareness strips away ego. It forces honesty. As the timeline compressed, my thoughts simplified. Not because the situation became clearer, but because complexity became unsustainable. The mind can only carry so much uncertainty before it demands a decision. This is how choice emerges, not from clarity, but from exhaustion. And standing there, watching preparations continue, I understood that waiting was no longer neutral. It was becoming a statement, one that would follow me long after the ceremony ended. This was the moment silence stopped feeling passive. Up until then, it had felt like hesitation, caution, maybe even responsibility. But something shifted, quietly, internally. And once that shift happened, it couldn't be undone. This was shocking because I realized how easily good intentions can slide into complicity without anyone noticing. Not through a single decision, but through a series of delays that each feel reasonable on their own. Let me explain how that realization took hold. I noticed my own language changing internally. I stopped saying, "I need more information," and started saying, "Maybe this isn't my place." That subtle shift matters. It moves responsibility away from action and toward avoidance, dressed up as respect. This is how people talk themselves out of doing hard things. I also began recognizing a familiar pattern, one I'd seen before in other contexts. Workplaces, families, friend groups. When something uncomfortable surfaces, the group often defaults to silence, hoping someone else will act. Responsibility becomes diffuse. And when responsibility is shared by everyone, it effectively belongs to no one. This was shocking because I realized I was participating in that pattern. The hardest part was accepting that no one had asked me to hold this information. I hadn't volunteered for this role. And yet, here I was, holding it anyway. That's how moral responsibility often works. It arrives uninvited and refuses to leave until acknowledged. I felt a growing tension between fairness and necessity. Fairness says people deserve to be informed directly, not through overheard fragments. Necessity says withholding information doesn't become ethical just because the method of acquisition was imperfect. This was shocking because it forced me to confront how often people use technicalities to avoid accountability. There's also a myth that speaking up requires absolute certainty, as if doubt invalidates concern. But in real life, waiting for certainty often means waiting too long, especially when the cost of inaction falls on someone else. I started noticing how silence was influencing my behavior. I avoided certain conversations. I stayed physically present but emotionally distant. I monitored my reactions. That's not neutrality. That's active management. This was shocking because I realized silence requires effort. It's not the absence of action. It's a continuous choice to maintain the status quo. I also thought about the long-term consequences of that effort. What happens when you train yourself to suppress truth for the sake of convenience? How easily that habit spreads into other areas of life. There's research on moral disengagement that shows people don't become unethical in dramatic leaps. They disengage in small steps, each one justified, each one easier than the last. This was shocking because I could see those steps forming. Another layer emerged then: self-protection. I didn't want to be the one blamed if things went wrong later. But I also didn't want to be blamed for disrupting the present. That double bind creates paralysis. No outcome feels safe. This is where silence feels tempting. It promises minimal immediate backlash. But that promise is misleading. It only delays reckoning. I thought about how stories get told after the fact, how people simplify complex situations into neat narratives, heroes and villains, right and wrong. Silence rarely looks good in hindsight. It's often reinterpreted as cowardice or indifference, regardless of the internal struggle that preceded it. This was shocking because I could already imagine future conversations shaped by choices not yet made. There's also the reality that truth has momentum. Once it exists, it tends to surface eventually. Secrets rarely stay contained. They leak through behavior, conflict, or timing. The only question is when and how much damage accumulates before that happens. This was shocking because silence doesn't prevent exposure. It only changes who controls it. I became aware of a deeper fear then, the fear of changing how someone sees me, of losing the role I occupied in their life. Speaking up can alter relational dynamics permanently. Silence preserves them temporarily, but temporary preservation often leads to permanent loss later. Another thought surfaced, one that felt uncomfortable but honest. If I were in my child's position, would I want to know? Not in theory, not someday, but now, with this timing, with these stakes. That question cut through rationalization quickly. This was shocking because the answer wasn't ambiguous. I also realized that my discomfort wasn't the result of overthinking. It was the result of misalignment. My values and my actions were drifting apart, and that drift creates internal friction that doesn't resolve on its own. This is how guilt forms. Not from doing something wrong, but from knowing what feels right and not acting on it. The longer I stayed silent, the heavier that friction became. It affected my mood, my focus, my presence. Silence was no longer protecting peace. It was eroding it. I started noticing how often people equate keeping the peace with preserving harmony. But harmony built on withheld truth is unstable. It requires constant maintenance and collapses under pressure. This was shocking because I could see the collapse coming without knowing exactly when. The realization settled slowly, but firmly. Silence was no longer an option that allowed me to remain neutral. It had become a choice that aligned me with avoidance rather than protection. And once you see that clearly, continuing to stay quiet stops being easier. It starts to feel like a betrayal of the very thing you're trying to preserve. This was the point where thinking stopped helping. Not because the situation became simpler, but because analysis reached its limit. I had circled every angle, weighed every consequence, replayed every possible outcome. And still, the answer refused to arrive neatly packaged. This was shocking because we're taught that careful thought leads to clarity, that if you just consider enough variables, the right choice will reveal itself. But some decisions don't offer certainty. They demand commitment without reassurance. Let me explain how that realization landed. I noticed my internal questions changing. Instead of asking, "What's the safest option?" I started asking, "What can I live with?" That shift matters. Safety is external. Living with something is internal. This is how real decisions announce themselves. The moment wasn't dramatic. There was no surge of confidence, no cinematic resolve, just a quiet understanding that waiting for perfect conditions was no longer honest. Action, whatever form it took, would be imperfect, and that imperfection would have to be accepted. This was shocking because I realized courage doesn't feel like strength. It feels like exposure. I also became aware of how much emotional energy had already been spent. Carrying this knowledge had drained me more than any single confrontation could. Silence had become heavier than speaking. That realization stripped away the illusion that waiting was easier. I thought about the nature of irreversible moments. How they rarely announce themselves. How they often look ordinary until they pass. The last chance to intervene rarely feels like a last chance at the time. This was shocking because I could sense that line approaching without knowing exactly where it lay. Another factor shaped the decision then: respect. Not the kind that avoids discomfort, but the kind that trusts someone's capacity to handle truth. Shielding someone from information assumes fragility. Sharing it acknowledges agency. This was shocking because I realized my silence had quietly been undermining that respect. I also considered how truth functions in relationships. It's not just information, it's a signal. It says, "I trust you enough to be honest. I believe you deserve to know." Withholding truth sends the opposite message, even when intentions are good. This was shocking because I could feel the relational cost accumulating invisibly. The fear of reaction remained. Of course it did. You can't predict how someone will respond to destabilizing information, especially under emotional pressure. But unpredictability doesn't absolve responsibility. This was the point where values took precedence over outcomes. I remembered something a therapist once said about integrity, that it's less about doing the right thing and more about acting in alignment with who you are willing to be after the consequences unfold. That idea stayed with me, because consequences were unavoidable either way. The only thing within my control was the alignment. I also thought about timing in a different way, not as a threat, but as a reality. The wedding was approaching whether I acted or not. Silence wouldn't stop time, speaking wouldn't either. Time was moving independently of my comfort. This was shocking because it reframed urgency. It wasn't created by the situation. It was revealed by it. There's also a strange clarity that emerges when you stop asking for permission. Not from others, but from your own fear. The moment you accept that discomfort is guaranteed, the question becomes what kind of discomfort is tolerable. This was shocking because it simplified everything. I realized that whatever I chose would involve pain. But one option involved temporary conflict and long-term honesty. The other involved temporary calm and long-term uncertainty. That contrast mattered. I didn't feel ready. That's important to say. Readiness did arrive. Decision did. This was shocking because we often confuse readiness with necessity. Sometimes necessity arrives first. I also recognized that I couldn't control the narrative that would follow. People would interpret my actions through their own lenses. Some would understand, some wouldn't. Trying to manage that was futile. This was freeing in an unexpected way. The final piece was responsibility, not imposed, chosen. The understanding that having the capacity to act creates a form of obligation, whether we like it or not. This was shocking because it made the decision feel less like a burden and more like a role I had already accepted simply by knowing what I knew. There was a quiet resolve then. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. The kind that doesn't need validation. And in that resolve, I understood something important. That choosing to speak isn't about forcing an outcome. It's about refusing to carry silence any longer. That clarity didn't bring peace, but it brought direction. And direction, in moments like this, is enough. This was the part no one ever tells you about. The moment after the decision, when you realize that choosing to speak doesn't instantly resolve anything. It simply opens a door that can never be closed again. Once words leave your mouth, they don't belong to you anymore. They land where they land, and whatever grows from them grows on its own terms. This was shocking because I expected relief, some sense of release. Instead, what I felt was vulnerability. Raw, exposed, unmistakable vulnerability. The kind that makes you aware of every breath, every pause, every shift in the other person's expression. Let me explain how the conversation actually unfolded. Not dramatically, not explosively. It began with hesitation, with ordinary words that tried to soften what couldn't truly be softened. I didn't launch into accusations or conclusions. I shared what I heard, how I heard it, what it made me feel. And then I stopped talking. That silence afterward was heavier than any argument could have been. This was shocking because silence changed meaning in that moment. Before, it was avoidance. Now it was processing. There's a difference. One protects comfort, the other signals impact. I watched the information land in real time. You can see it when someone's internal world shifts. Their eyes lose focus for a second. Their breathing changes. Their posture tightens or collapses slightly. That's the body reacting before language catches up. This was shocking because it reminded me that truth doesn't arrive gently just because it's spoken gently. There was confusion first. Questions, clarifications, a need to understand context. That part felt manageable, almost procedural. But underneath it all was something deeper, a recalibration of reality. And that process doesn't follow a script. I noticed how instinctively people look for meaning. Not just facts, but explanations that restore a sense of control. Why now? Why this way? Why didn't I know? Those questions weren't accusations. They were attempts to stabilize a shaken foundation. This was shocking because it showed me how fragile certainty really is. I also became aware of my own reactions, the urge to defend myself, to justify timing, to explain hesitation. But I resisted that. Not because I was right, but because defensiveness would shift the focus away from what mattered most in that moment. This is how restraint becomes an act of care. There were moments of disbelief. That quiet skepticism that asks whether something this disruptive can really be true. That response isn't denial. It's self-protection. The mind buffering itself against overload. This was shocking because I recognized it instantly, having experienced a version of it myself earlier. As the conversation continued, emotions surfaced unevenly. Not in a clean arc. They overlapped. Concern mixed with anger. Gratitude mixed with fear. That emotional complexity is uncomfortable, especially when there's pressure to respond decisively. I realized then how unrealistic our expectations of emotional clarity are. We expect people to know exactly how they feel and what they want to do next. But real reactions are messy. They contradict themselves. They evolve minute by minute. This was shocking because it challenged the idea that conversations like this produce answers. Sometimes they only produce awareness. There was also a moment when the weight of timing fully landed. The proximity of the wedding transformed the conversation from theoretical to urgent. Every option suddenly carried immediate consequences. That pressure hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. This was shocking because urgency doesn't make decisions easier. It makes them louder. I noticed how quickly the focus shifted from the content of the confession to its implications. What does this mean now? What happens next? Who else knows? Who needs to know? Those questions reveal how humans instinctively move from shock to strategy. But strategy doesn't erase emotion, it just coexists with it. I could feel trust stretching, not snapping, but stretching. And that stretching hurt. Trust doesn't break cleanly. It thins, it strains, it demands careful handling if it's going to survive change. This was shocking because I realized trust can be tested without being destroyed. There was also a moment of silence that felt different from all the others. Not heavy, not tense, just quiet. A pause where both of us were sitting with the same truth at the same time for the first time. That shared awareness mattered. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel like I had done something heroic. I felt responsible, in a deeper way than before. Speaking didn't transfer the burden, it redistributed it. This was shocking because I understood then that telling the truth doesn't end responsibility, it transforms it. The conversation didn't resolve everything. It couldn't. Some questions remained unanswered. Some feelings remained unresolved. But the reality had shifted. Silence was no longer controlling the situation. That alone changed the dynamic. I also noticed something unexpected. Despite the difficulty, there was a subtle sense of alignment returning inside me. Not comfort, but coherence. My actions matched my values again. That internal friction I had been carrying began to ease, even as external tension increased. This was shocking because it revealed how internal peace doesn't always align with external calm. As the conversation reached a natural pause, not an ending, just a pause, I realized something important. Speaking didn't create chaos. It revealed it. Whatever instability followed had existed already, hidden behind ceremony and expectation. This was shocking because it reframed responsibility. I hadn't caused the problem. I had interrupted the illusion. And standing there in the aftermath of words that could not be taken back, I understood that the real impact of that conversation wouldn't be visible immediately. It would unfold over time, in decisions made quietly, in trust rebuilt or redefined, in futures adjusted in ways no one could fully predict. This was the phase that surprised me the most, because it didn't look the way movies or stories suggest it should. There was no explosion, no dramatic fallout, no clear resolution. Instead, there was a strange in-between state, where everything continued to move forward while nothing felt settled. This was shocking because I assumed that once the truth was spoken, something decisive would happen. A plan, a confrontation, a reversal, but real life rarely offers immediate clarity. It offers adjustment. Slow, uneven, emotionally disorienting adjustment. Let me explain what that looked like. On the surface, things appeared normal. Preparations continued. Schedules stayed intact. Conversations returned to logistics. But underneath that surface, something fundamental had shifted. The atmosphere felt altered, not tense exactly, just aware. Awareness changes everything. People spoke more carefully. Pauses grew longer. Eye contact lingered a second too long or disappeared entirely. It wasn't hostility. It was recalibration. Everyone was silently updating their understanding of what was happening, what might happen, and what they were allowed to say out loud. This was shocking because it revealed how much social behavior is based on assumed reality. Once that reality cracks, even slightly, everything becomes tentative. I noticed how information began moving differently. Not openly, but indirectly. Through tone, through questions that weren't really questions, through statements framed as observations. This is how humans process uncertainty together without naming it directly. This was shocking because it showed me that truth doesn't just inform, it reorganizes. Another unexpected effect was emotional fatigue. Not just for me, but for everyone involved. Holding new information takes energy. especially when there's no clear action attached to it yet. People underestimate how exhausting awareness can be. That fatigue created moments of numbness, times when emotions seemed muted, not because they were gone, but because the system was overloaded. The brain sometimes dampens feeling to preserve function. This was shocking because numbness can look like indifference, even when it is. I also became aware of how quickly people search for normalcy after disruption. There's comfort in routine, in checklists, in tasks that don't require emotional engagement. Normalcy becomes a coping mechanism, but that normalcy was fragile. It depended on not pushing too hard, not asking too much, not forcing resolution prematurely. This was shocking because it highlighted how healing and avoidance can look similar from the outside. I found myself questioning my role again. Not with regret, but with curiosity. What does responsibility look like after truth is shared? When do you step back? When do you stay close? There's no clear guidance for that phase. Speaking up didn't make me a leader. It made me a participant in a process that now belonged to more than just me. That realization was humbling. I also noticed subtle shifts in trust, not broken, adjusted. Trust is rarely destroyed in one moment. More often, it's renegotiated. Expectations change. Boundaries shift. Assumptions are revised. This was shocking because it showed me that trust isn't static. It's responsive. There were moments of guilt that surfaced unexpectedly. Not guilt for speaking, but guilt for the impact, for the discomfort, for the weight now shared. Even when action is right, the emotional cost doesn't disappear. This was shocking because it challenged the idea that doing the right thing feels good. I also observed something else. Silence didn't return in the same way. It still existed, but it wasn't hiding the same thing anymore. It was no longer the default strategy. It was more intentional, more selective. This was shocking because silence, once disrupted, loses its dominance. There were also moments of connection that surprised me. Small ones, honest ones, conversations that didn't solve anything but acknowledged reality. Those moments mattered more than dramatic gestures would have. They signaled adaptation. I realized then that aftermath isn't about outcomes, it's about integration. How people absorb truth into their existing lives without everything falling apart. That process is slow, uneven, sometimes invisible. This was shocking because it contradicted the expectation that truth always leads to immediate change. I also had to confront my own need for closure, the desire to know how this would end, whether I had protected or harmed, whether my timing was right or wrong. But closure doesn't arrive on demand, especially not in situations that continue to evolve. This was shocking because it forced me to sit with uncertainty without trying to fix it. There was a moment when I realized that my anxiety wasn't about the wedding anymore. It was about the future, about how this truth would echo beyond the event itself, into relationships, into trust, into choices not yet made. Truth doesn't stop working once it's spoken. That understanding brought a different kind of calm. Not peace, acceptance. The acceptance that outcomes unfold gradually and that control is limited. I also noticed that my internal state continued to change. The constant tension I had been carrying was gone, not replaced by relief but by steadiness. I could think again, listen again, be present without constantly managing internal alarms. This was shocking because it showed me how heavy silence had been without my realizing it. As time passed, it became clear that nothing had been ruined, despite everyone's fears. Things were altered. Yes, complicated, absolutely, but not destroyed. That distinction matters. I began to understand that disruption isn't inherently harmful. Sometimes it's corrective. Sometimes it prevents greater damage later, even when it hurts. This was shocking because it reframed disruption as a form of care. And living in that aftermath, watching people adjust in their own ways, I realized that the most significant change wasn't visible on the outside. It was internal. A recalibration of values, trust, and honesty that would continue shaping decisions long after the event itself had passed. This was the part that unfolded slowly, almost quietly, long after the intensity of the moment had passed. Not during the conversations, not during the immediate aftermath, but in the space where reflection finally had room to breathe. That's where the real lessons surfaced. This was shocking because I realized how much of what we call love is actually fear wearing a softer name. Fear of upsetting someone, fear of losing access, fear of being misunderstood. Silence often feels loving because it avoids discomfort, but that doesn't mean it serves the people we care about. Let me explain how that realization settled in. I started examining my own motivations more honestly. not the polished ones, the uncomfortable ones, the moments where staying quiet wasn't about protection, but about avoiding pain for myself. That doesn't make someone cruel, it makes them human, but recognizing that distinction matters. I saw how control had been quietly operating under the surface. Not dominance, not manipulation, just subtle control. The belief that by managing information, by choosing timing, by withholding certain truths, outcomes could be shaped more safely. This was shocking because control often disguises itself as responsibility. Parents do this more than they admit. We tell ourselves we're protecting our children from complexity, from distress, from consequences. But at some point, protection crosses into interference. And interference, even when well-intentioned, limits growth. This realization wasn't comfortable. It required admitting that silence wasn't just about timing, it was about control over outcomes I had no right to manage. Another layer emerged then: trust. Not trust in others, but trust in reality. Trust that people can handle more than we think. Trust that discomfort doesn't automatically mean damage. Trust that truth, even when destabilizing, doesn't always destroy. This was shocking because silence often reflects a lack of that trust. I also started noticing how often society rewards quiet compliance. The person who doesn't make waves, the one who keeps things smooth, the one who prioritizes harmony over honesty. Those people are praised for being mature, supportive, respectful, but maturity without honesty becomes performance. This was shocking because it reframed social approval as a potential trap. I thought about how many conflicts in families aren't caused by truth, but by delayed truth. By information arriving too late to be integrated gently, by silence stretching tension until it snaps. That pattern is common, yet rarely acknowledged. Another uncomfortable realization followed. Silence allows others to project their own assumptions. When you don't speak, people fill in the gaps, often incorrectly, and those assumptions can harden into beliefs that are difficult to undo. This was shocking because silence doesn't preserve neutrality, it invites misinterpretation. I also reflected on how difficult it is to separate love from ownership. We say my child, my family, my role. And without realizing it, that language can foster entitlement over decisions that aren't ours to make. Speaking up forced me to release some of that ownership. To accept that my role wasn't to decide outcomes, but to offer truth and support autonomy. This was shocking because it challenged long-held identity assumptions. There's also a lesson here about emotional courage. Not the loud kind, the kind that tolerates being misunderstood, the kind that accepts short-term discomfort for long-term alignment, the kind that doesn't demand immediate validation. Silence avoids conflict. Courage absorbs it. I realized that my fear of causing pain had overshadowed my respect for resilience. Pain is part of life. Avoiding it at all costs doesn't prepare anyone for reality. It only delays exposure. This was shocking because it reframed pain as information, not failure. Another insight emerged around timing. There's rarely a perfect moment to speak uncomfortable truth. Waiting for ideal conditions often means waiting indefinitely. The absence of a perfect moment doesn't absolve responsibility. This was shocking because it dismantled the illusion of readiness. I also learned something about humility. Speaking up didn't make me right, it made me accountable. It required accepting that my understanding could be incomplete, that my interpretation could be flawed, and that my intentions didn't guarantee positive outcomes. That humility is essential. Without it, honesty becomes self-righteous. I noticed how much lighter I felt once control was released, not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer trying to manage what wasn't mine to manage. That release created space for others to step into their own agency. This was shocking because it revealed how heavy control had been. I also saw how silence can create invisible hierarchies. Those who know and those who don't. Those who decide and those who are decided for. Truth equalizes. It distributes power more fairly. This was shocking because it showed silence as a form of imbalance. Over time, the initial fear of speaking faded, not replaced by confidence, but by acceptance. Acceptance that being honest sometimes costs you comfort, sometimes costs you approval, but preserves integrity. And integrity, I learned, isn't about being right. It's about being aligned. Looking back, I no longer framed the situation as a single decision. It was a process, a sequence of realizations that shifted how I understand love, control, and responsibility. Silence taught me that protecting someone from truth doesn't protect them from reality. It only protects the illusion for a while longer. This was the stage where perspective changed quietly, without announcement. Not because anything dramatic happened next, but because my way of seeing everything around me had shifted. Once silence is broken, you don't return to the same viewpoint. Even ordinary moments start to look different. This was shocking because I didn't expect the change to be so subtle. I thought I would feel either justified or regretful. Instead, I felt observant, more aware. As if a filter had been removed and I was finally seeing interactions as they actually were, not as I wanted them to be. Let me explain how that showed up. Conversations felt layered. Words carried more meaning. Pauses spoke louder than sentences. I noticed how often people communicate indirectly when they're unsure, and how much emotional labor goes into maintaining appearances. This was shocking because I realized how much of daily life is negotiated rather than stated. I also noticed how narratives began forming almost immediately. Not official ones, but quiet interpretations. People tried to make sense of what had happened in ways that felt manageable to them. Some framed it as caution, some as interference, some as concern. None of those labels captured the full truth, but each revealed something about the person using it. This was shocking because it showed me how quickly complexity gets flattened into stories. What surprised me most was how little control I had over those stories. Once truth enters a shared space, it becomes communal property. People reshape it, reinterpret it, soften it, sharpen it. That loss of control can feel unsettling, especially if you're used to managing outcomes. This was shocking because it forced me to release ownership over meaning, not just action. I also became aware of how relationships subtly recalibrate after moments like this. Some grew quieter, not colder, just more careful. Others became more open, as if honesty had created permission for deeper conversation. Change didn't happen evenly. It never does. This was shocking because it reminded me that impact is personal, not universal. I found myself less reactive than before. Not detached, but steadier. Having faced the discomfort I feared most, smaller tensions didn't feel as threatening. There's something grounding about surviving the moment you thought might break everything. This was shocking because it revealed resilience I hadn't credited myself with. Another shift was how I viewed responsibility going forward. I no longer felt obligated to manage everyone's emotional experience. Speaking up had clarified boundaries. What happened next belonged to others. Support didn't require control. This was shocking because it freed up emotional energy I didn't realize I was spending. I also noticed how often people avoid revisiting difficult moments once the immediate pressure passes. There's a collective tendency to move on quickly, to let things fade without examination. That avoidance can prevent healing, but it can also serve as a temporary coping mechanism. This was shocking because it challenged the idea that processing must be immediate to be valid. There were moments of doubt, of course. Quiet ones, late ones. The kind that surface when distractions fall away. I would wonder if I could have handled things differently, chosen different words, timed it better. Those questions didn't demand answers, they were part of integration. This was shocking because doubt didn't feel destabilizing anymore. It felt reflective. I also realized how much silence teaches you about power, who speaks freely, who waits, who adjusts, who absorbs discomfort. Once you notice those patterns, they're hard to ignore. This was shocking because it expanded the lesson beyond the original situation. I became more sensitive to moments when truth was being softened unnecessarily. Not out of cruelty, but out of habit. That awareness didn't make me confrontational. It made me curious. Why are we avoiding this? Who are we protecting? At what cost? This was shocking because it shifted my default response from compliance to consideration. I also saw how moments like this can reset personal standards. What you tolerate, what you question, what you let pass. After crossing a certain internal threshold, it's harder to go back to pretending you don't notice misalignment. This was shocking because it marked a quiet internal boundary. Another unexpected change was compassion, not just for others, but for myself. I understood better why hesitation had felt necessary at first, why fear had played such a strong role. That compassion reduced self-judgment without erasing accountability. This was shocking because self-compassion didn't weaken responsibility, it strengthened it. I noticed how people sometimes tested the new dynamic subtly. Small comments, indirect questions, they weren't challenges, they were checks. Is honesty still allowed? Is the space still safe? This was shocking because it showed how environments adjust to truth over time. The world didn't feel heavier after speaking. It felt clearer. Even when things were unresolved, there was less internal noise, less second guessing, less suppression. This was shocking because clarity came without certainty. I also recognized that moments like this don't just change one relationship, they ripple outward. They influence how you handle future conflicts, how quickly you speak, how long you wait. This was shocking because it revealed how a single choice can recalibrate behavior long term. Looking around, nothing appeared radically different. The same people, the same routines, but the lens through which I experienced them had changed. I wasn't carrying silence anymore. And without that weight, everything felt slightly more grounded, slightly more honest. Even when uncomfortable, this was the moment when reflection began to settle, not like a conclusion, but like sediment slowly forming at the bottom of a turbulent stream. Everything that had happened, every conversation, every pause, every anxious calculation, began to merge into lessons that weren't abstract. They were practical, tangible, and deeply personal. This was shocking because I realized that the most profound lessons aren't taught in grand moments or dramatic confrontations. They're absorbed quietly, almost unconsciously, through experience and reflection. You don't notice them at first. Then one day, they shape the way you respond without announcement. Let me explain how this awareness grew. The first lesson was about courage, not the kind applauded in stories or movies, but the kind that exists in ordinary life. The courage to say something that could change everything, to speak a truth that might create discomfort, to step forward when the path is unclear. That courage doesn't feel heroic. It feels exposed, risky, and raw. And yet it teaches resilience in a way that comfort never can. This was shocking because I realized that courage often masquerades as fear. They feel similar in the body: tight chest, quickened heartbeat, hesitation. The difference isn't in sensation, it's in action. Courage moves forward despite fear. Silence, by contrast, allows fear to dictate the pace and direction of life. Another lesson emerged around timing. I had spent so much energy calculating the right moment, waiting for perfect conditions that never existed. And in that waiting, the weight of silence grew heavier with each passing hour. I learned that the perfect moment rarely arrives, and waiting for it often magnifies consequences rather than mitigating them. Timing isn't a guarantee of safety. It's a context for action. This was shocking because I realized how much of human stress comes from imagining ideal circumstances that simply don't exist. We act as though reality should bend to our comfort, when in fact discomfort is the natural environment for difficult choices. The third lesson was about responsibility. Not the kind imposed externally, but the kind that emerges internally when knowledge or awareness comes into your hands. Holding information isn't neutral. Choosing whether to act or not defines how you carry yourself morally and emotionally. Responsibility is heavier than it appears until you confront its consequences firsthand. This was shocking because I recognized how often people confuse avoidance with neutrality. Doing nothing may feel harmless, but in reality, it has its own weight, one that can accumulate silently until it shapes relationships and outcomes in ways we never intended. I also learned that honesty carries its own rhythm. Speaking the truth doesn't guarantee immediate understanding. Sometimes it causes confusion, doubt, or even resentment. But honesty establishes a baseline. It signals respect for the other person's agency and allows relationships to adjust in authentic ways. Deception or omission, even for protective reasons, complicates this rhythm, creating distortions that can last far longer than the initial discomfort. This was shocking because I realized how often silence masquerades as kindness. It may prevent immediate conflict, but it rarely prevents long-term consequences. Silence protects comfort, but not integrity. Another profound lesson centered on trust. Speaking the truth didn't destroy trust, but it reshaped it. It demanded recalibration. Trust isn't static. It's a living system that adapts to what people reveal about themselves. When you act with transparency, even if it introduces tension, trust has the chance to evolve authentically. This was shocking because I had always assumed that honesty, particularly when inconvenient, would automatically fracture relationships. Instead, I saw that it often reinforces them, provided the intent is aligned and delivered with care. I noticed how reflection also highlighted the difference between empathy and interference. The desire to shield someone from discomfort is natural, especially as a parent, friend, or partner. But shielding isn't always protective. It can limit growth and autonomy. True empathy sometimes requires embracing discomfort for both parties because it respects the other person's capacity to process reality. This was shocking because it reframed my understanding of care. Love isn't only about comfort, it's about accountability, respect, and shared reality. Sometimes the kindest act is the hardest one to perform. Another key lesson was about the ripple effect of action. Speaking up doesn't only impact the immediate moment, it influences future decisions, interactions, and perceptions. One act of honesty can shift dynamics, reset boundaries, and establish patterns of communication for years to come. This was shocking because I realized how small moments carry echoes far beyond their apparent scale. Actions aren't isolated, they propagate through relationships like waves, touching areas we might never fully see or anticipate. I also learned about self-awareness. In processing everything, I became acutely aware of my motivations. Why had I hesitated? What fears were driving me? What assumptions had gone unexamined? Understanding my internal processes didn't absolve responsibility, but it gave clarity about why I acted as I did. Clarity, in turn, allowed me to respond more intentionally in the future. This was shocking because self-awareness is rarely comfortable. It exposes flaws, biases, and contradictions that we often prefer to ignore, yet confronting them is essential for authentic action. Another layer of insight involved the nature of emotional labor. Silence carries its own energy cost. Managing uncertainty, calculating timing, weighing consequences, these consume attention and psychological bandwidth. Speaking truth doesn't eliminate emotional labor, it redistributes it. But in many ways, redistribution is more sustainable than carrying the weight alone. This was shocking because I had underestimated how much effort avoidance required. Silence isn't passive, it's active maintenance of a fragile balance that benefits no one entirely. I also reflected on the importance of humility in truth-telling. Acting honestly doesn't make one infallible. Misjudgments happen, misinterpretations occur. But humility keeps intentions clear, allows space for dialogue, and prevents the erosion of relational trust under the guise of certainty. This was shocking because humility isn't weakness. It's a form of strength that preserves connection even in difficult circumstances. Perhaps the most profound lesson centered on the interplay between love and autonomy. True care respects the other person's ability to handle truth, to make decisions, and to navigate consequences. Protectiveness, when taken too far, can inadvertently undermine autonomy. Speaking honestly respects the individual's agency, even when it introduces tension. This was shocking because I realized how often love is conflated with control. To love effectively, one must release the desire to dictate outcomes while remaining engaged, supportive, and present. Finally, the overarching lesson was about presence. Being fully present, emotionally, mentally, and ethically, changes how we experience relationships. Presence allows us to act with clarity, respond with intentionality, and observe outcomes without being consumed by them. Presence turns uncertainty into a navigable landscape rather than an unbearable burden. This was shocking because I had spent so much time anticipating consequences that I failed to inhabit the moment. Speaking, reflecting, and observing taught me that clarity comes not from control, but from attentive presence. In summary, the events surrounding the confession and my reaction became a complex map of human experience. Courage, timing, responsibility, honesty, trust, empathy, ripple effects, self-awareness, emotional labor, humility, love, autonomy, and presence, all intertwined to shape not only that moment, but the way I approach life going forward. This was shocking because I realized that lessons rarely arrive packaged neatly. They emerge gradually, embedded in experience, reflection, and the ongoing challenge of being human. And once absorbed, they continue to influence decisions, relationships, and internal landscapes in ways that are subtle, profound, and enduring. Even now, as I recount this story, I notice threads of these lessons in the smallest choices I make, the words I choose, and the ways I respond to uncertainty. They are invisible in their immediacy, but powerful in their accumulation. And that is the enduring effect of a moment of truth. It teaches far more than the immediate situation, reshaping perception, behavior, and understanding in ways no one can fully anticipate. I'm not asking you to like this video. I'm not asking you to subscribe. I'm asking you to pause. Think about the last secret you almost spoke or the last truth you almost avoided. Then do this. Share this video with one person who might need permission to choose wisdom over impulse. Because sometimes the most powerful reaction isn't the loudest one. It's the one that changes the ending.